So I want again to thank you all that are here today with me, the Bond Center of Dependency and Slavery Studies, and the organizers of the Joseph Miller Memorial Lecture Series. Thank you very much, Jan, for all the efforts and for the invitation to participate today. I was really hoping to share with you in presence this moment, but for obvious reasons, I can only send you big hugs from my home in Sucre, Bolivia. I'm sure we will meet again soon in presence. Today, I want to share with you a reflection about a particular labor system, the Yanaconazgo, and about the experience of the workers attached to it. These reflections have another preliminary ones as president, which were part of a chapter in my PhD thesis on slavery and other forms of servitude in Charcas, Bolivia, colonial Bolivia, soon to be published by the Gruyter. This time, I would like to dwell on some discursive and methodological limitations that sometimes avoid us from understanding the intrinsic complexity and heterogeneity of this specific labor system. For this, I will, and I excuse myself for my English if sometimes it's not pretty clear, just tell me. I will combine the historiographic commentary with the analysis of very little known data sources from a very, very precise and paradigmatic context, the city of La Plata, within the jurisdiction of the Royal Audiencia of Charcas, colonial ancestor of Bolivia, as I said. The idea is that this data could be eventually compared and discussed under the light of new findings in other contexts, and thus enrich the approach to the large range of labor situations that this institution generated while it was in force. 5 specific aspects will guide this lecture today. I will first question the search or the will of the historiographic reading to find a single meaning of Yanaconazgo as an institution in the long term, in the longue durée. Then I will concentrate on what I call the trap of the dicotomous and legalistic questioning about the Yanacona. Slave or free? Showing you some features of the context of La Plata in the early colonial period. In the third and fourth part of this lecture, I will analyze the limitations of reading the Yanacona subject as eminently masculine, adult, and exclusively indigenous. In addition, those that generate certain ethnical essentialism that leads to read the institution as an exclusively indigenous experience seem a limitation for me, but I will show you why. Before ending, I will refer to the actions guided by the people involved in this labor system and their use of their affiliation or sometimes self-affiliation to Yanaconazgo when it was necessary and possible for them and according to the particular objectives they were pursuing. Well, the existence of the Yanaconazgo as a labor institution has been documented at least since the 14th century during the Inca period. It goes through the colonial period in Bolivia and reaches around in Charcas, and reaches around 1960s in the 19th century in Bolivia. Authors who mention it or who have approached its study in a certain context are aware of this long-standing. However, very few of them have analyzed the changes of meaning that the term went through between one political regime and another. It is not correct to simplify and say that the Spanish reproduced this Inca labor system in the colonial context. More than his transposition, the Viceroy Francisco de Toledo saw its readjustment to the economic and fiscal needs of the new regime and at the end of the 16th century. Today, researchers such as Francisco Cuena, for example, notice an evident similarity of the legal status of colonial Yanaconas with that of the gleba servants of medieval Europe, for example. Meanwhile, at the beginning of the 17th century, Juan Solórzano y Pereira compared them with the solariegos, vassals of Spain. It will be more precise to consider maybe different institutions also linked and designated under the same benchmark. In fact, in her 17th century analysis of Yanaconazgo in Potosí, Laura Escobari notes that very little was left of the Inca connotations of this labor system, except that of the link with imposed servitude. Much less attention has been given to the study of this labor system, of this labor institution, in the scenario of transition to the republican context in the Bolivian 19th century. The 19th century Bolivia. An exception is the beautiful contribution of Maria Luisa Sux on the change in the legal status of Yanacona from 1825 until the agrarian reform in Bolivia of 1953, so 20th century. It would have gone hand in hand with a change in lexicon that led to the generalization of terms such as colono and arrendero. However, the system and the labor relationship, and this is very important, would have changed very little, in contradiction with the liberal regulations of the time. Another important aspect when approaching the study of this labor system are the synchronous differences that were generated. John Murrah noticed them long time ago, warning about the impossibility of referring to a unitary and definite institution in the pre-Hispanic period that he studied. He considered it more appropriate to refer to a variety of situations of servitude, pointing out that all the Yanacona had in common the uprooting of their community of origin and the direct dependence on the political religious power of the Tahuantinsuyo. Joseph Barnadas, historian, agreed with this appreciation for the colonial period in his case. Currently, these days, Lia Oliveto, Raquel Gil Montero, and Fernando Longi warn and emphasize the relevance of the study of this diversity in a great way, by the way. There is still a lot of work, I think, to be done on the various realities that flow from the Yanaconazgo, from a perspective that considers, for example, its engagement with other labor systems. Just as it is important to make a reflection on the space-time consideration and complexity, it's not possible to overlook that the Yanaconazgo, and it's something that you would say it's obvious, but we have to really take care of this point. Yanaconazgo was not only the formally established institution, but a labor system molded in the daily interaction of people. The perception and meaning that contemporaries gave to the term and its derivatives, as well as the testimony of the workers' experience, are fundamental for historical reading. This leads to consider the sources with which historians have been working. Most of them have privileged the study of normative and official documentation. However, the information they provide must be crossed with that of another type of documentation, such as court records and notarial acts, which reflect more everyday experience but are kind of more difficult to work in the archives because they take longer. In this sense, I think also that it's not pertinent to settle for the quantitative perspective around almost anonymous groups assigned to one or other category. We cannot just have enough with quantitative perspective. It's essential to cross it, to land the figures, the numbers, by comparing them with specific trends that the diversity of work experience in a region different from those of another, or cross-sectional to a broader space, may eventually show. The analysis must be made from samples large enough, and that's important because it's not always the case, to take the pulse of the specific local reality of the Yanacona as a subject without falling into generalizations, but also, and not least, taking into account the specific context of the individual stories of workers. The case study should not be seen only as functional to numerical data or as an anecdotal illustration. And I think that's a mistake sometimes we fall into. The micro-historical approach can be very, very useful and an ally in this task from new interpretative aspects such as those that labor history has been proposing. I'm thinking here of the proposal of Christian De Vito and Anne Gerritsen, who have highlighted, for example, the richness of the micro-spatial approach in a compared perspective in the longue durée. It's precisely I think, in the diversity of human experience where senses of identification are created, those that are not always reflected by the political power in its eagerness to impose an order, and that can end up overflowing and forcing it to adapt its lexicon. Another methodologically important aspect, I think, when we approach the study of Yanaconazgo is not getting trapped trying to solve the slavery-freedom dichotomy. Some researchers in the second half of the 20th century argued that this labor system in the Inca state period would be assimilated to that of slavery. In times of late Tawantinsuyo, the Yanacona, separated from their community of origin and divided by the Inca among different lords, worked as perpetual servants, as Ciesa de Leon remembers, inheriting their status from their descendants. However, it is at least hasty to assimilate them to slaves in a legal sense of the colonial term. Uprooted, the Yanacona were not required to make rotating personal benefits. In fact, their degree of specialization in a diversity of agricultural and craft tasks allowed them to live in a certain privileged situation with different treatment and public recognition. In the colonial setting, several historians have highlighted the autonomy of economic development in which they found Yanaconas as a result of the degree of specialization that they enjoyed in certain tasks. In Potosí, for example, at the end of the 16th century, Peter Bakewell already said and found them among the main metal smelters, guairadores, as they didn't have to participate in the mita, in the colonial mineral mita, and they were able to trade. They conducted themselves with more autonomy than other indigenous. Despite this initial situation, Bakewell says there were also rapid changes, as we know, in the labor system at the end of 16th century as a result of the falling of the mining production in Potosí that became more noticeable in the first decades of 17th century, and this would have taken away some of their most important privilege. A few kilometers from Potosí, in the jurisdiction of La Plata, we found a paradigmatic context in those decades, since it allows us to see realities that are diametrically differentiated simultaneously. In the city, around 1575, 103 resident Yanaconas were counted. Their ages ranged from 17 to 50 years, averaging most in their 30s. About 30% had a job specialization, including tailors, knitters, weavers, silversmiths, all with the rank of officers. They were part of the service of well-known neighbors and enjoyed a wide autonomy for their work. They had to have free time for their deals and farms, and could celebrate annual work contracts. Some inherited assets from their masters and rose economically, becoming owners of farms and slaves. In the words of the chronicler Fray Antonio de la Calancha, I quote, "Registered on them as Yanaconas, they are already owners, having been upstarts," in the sense that most of them have come from other regions, particularly from Cusco at that time, as they themselves declared when they were registered. There were also Yanaconas who carried out different tasks for the benefit of the crown institutions, the Yanaconas del Rey that Raquel Gil has studied. Those of the church participated in the construction of public works, and I saw them in La Plata, in artisan and service activities within convents and hospitals, such as the one of Santa Barbara, that is just 3 blocks from here, where they cared for the sick. They were guaranteed housing and 50 pesos of annual payment. From the provisions of Viceroy Toledo, the Yanaconas, we have to remember this, had to pay a tax in currency for those, for whose control a branch was created at the royal treasury. There was also a cacique of Yanaconas, but I'm not going to enter in those details today. While some Yanaconas enjoyed undeniable autonomy and economic prosperity in the city, in the surrounding farms, the situation of others did not differ much from the gleba servitude of medieval Europe, and in some cases from slavery. At the end of the 16th century, the interest of those who, not having received an encomienda or repartimientos, sought to obtain labor for crops and domestic service, led to extensive hiring of Yanaconas. Reality shows that these workers suffered all kinds of abuses, that the ordinances of Viceroy Toledo of June 14, 1589, specific for the Yanaconas of the farms of La Plata, sought to alleviate without much success. Any intention to regulate this labor system had to consider the reaction of the farmers, the chacareros, attentive not to be harmed. According to this ordinance of Toledo, the Yanaconas had to work for their lord and enjoy the usufruct of a piece of land that they did not possess. Their masters were to give them something to wear annually, heal their illness, and give them protection. However, testimonies collected during the visit or the census of a farm in 1613 reveals daily abuses and excesses toward the workers. In Huañoma, for example, property of Cabrera family, the Yanaconas reported, I quote, that they give each year a piece of clothing to each Indian and that this year they do not pay these pieces and they owe them. Complaints because they did not have freedom of movement, they were not given enough animals and tools, they were not always allowed to sell their products, and they did not have enough time to work on their own benefit were very, very usual. There's no lack of information on rented Yanaconas to pay their tax. The masters rented them to other people. Furthermore, they used to be included in sales and land transfers as if they were a possession of the farmer, a practice forbidden by Toledo. Even the term all the terms they used in the relationship were at least ambiguous and similar to that of the slavery relationship. In the census of 1575 of Matienzo, all urban Yanaconas are characterized as Indian of, who belonged to, Indian without owner, and under the authority of a master. It's not surprising to find also the reference to Yanaconas as assets inherited in Wales. Despite this reality, local authorities refused to admit that it could be anyway compared to slavery. Not even that it could be described as enslaving practice, preferring to speak of reduced or conditioned freedom. Matienzo compared them, Juan de Matienzo, to the solariegos in Spain, whose freedom was restricted by their hereditary attachment to the land or of the lord for whom they worked. In a deeply legalistic tone, the authorities of Charcas around 1608 clarified that they were not properly slaves, whose condition was unique. The one of free people, they said, could be of many ways, in their opinion. And they reminded the king that they were, I quote, men who, being free, have somewhat reduced the right to freedom and have it conditioned. A subtle link was then drawn between rural Yanaconazgo and colonial slavery in La Plata, calling it into question the crown's provisions against indigenous personal service, of course. An important detail has to be added. Not all the workers assigned to the Yanacona category were part of the census that Toledo had ordered. On March 20, 1574, Toledo described that the province of Los Charcas had 364 states and approximately 5,500 Yanaconas registered. According to Roberto Levillier, through information from Toledo, there were at least 3,000 workers in the La Plata environment. At the beginning of the 17th century, Francisco de Alfaro registered a total of 8,741 Yanaconas in the almost 920 farms during his visit in 1611. He said 554 Yanaconas registered in the Toledo census, the 1,225 of his descendants, and the significant number of 1,782 relatives who were not registered in the initial census, and a similar number of indigenous under 20 years that were inside or outside the La Plata district, or that came from different parts of Charcas. Many indigenous from the surrounding area became Yanaconas in practice, without having been registered on the original census of Toledo, under the formula of voluntary Yanaconazgo. The argument put forward by the authorities of the Audiencia was that it was better to force some indigenous to work to prevent them from wandering, getting drunk, and stealing. Those arguments are very common, you know. In 1604, they referred to the crown that these workers used to flee from their village to the Spanish farms. This dynamic can be explained rather by the desire to get out of the obligations of the mining mita. Further, very few really knew what conditions of servitude they were engaging in. This diversity of situations, as well as the criteria of regulation and articulation of illegalities, must, in my opinion, prevail in the analysis, instead of forcing the subject into legalistic compartments that do not take account of the diversity of coercive conditions in which people were immersed under the same labor categorization. Now we fall into the third part. Historians tend to focus on Yanaconazgo, assimilating it to an eminently masculine and adult activity, because legally only men between 18 and 50 years could be part of it. However, there's plenty of evidence of an unexplored reality that deserves to be studied in detail, that of women and children who participated in this labor system. Their presence leads us to verify the intrinsic plurality of the Yanacona subject on its labor dynamics, focusing not only on the formally assigned individual, but also on the other linked members of the family. Women appear frequently registered along with their husbands and children in various lists of Yanaconas. They are often mentioned as wife or woman of Yanacona. Sometimes also there are other terms to refer to them as workers, but it should not be surprising, and this is where I want to make the point, that sometimes in La Plata I found documentation where they are called Yanaconas on their own, these women, directly ascribing them to this, affiliating them to this form of servitude. In 1683, Luisa de la Cruz, for example, would have been visited as Yanacona. Likewise, in the memory aid that a priest made of the workers who he confessed in the hacienda of Vilanche in 17th century, he mentions that several women were Yanaconas, differentiating them from slaves, but also from the free people. Legally, in the farms, women were not bounded to work the land. They could, however, participate voluntarily in the domestic service of the house of the landowners, where their male relatives worked. However, it has, as I have been able to verify, in practice they also participated in sewing. There's a very eloquent case that of Diego Moreno in Poroma's farm, when the Yanaconas' wives were questioned about their daily task. They said, I quote, that they are forced to work like the Yanaconas Indians in sowing and harvesting, and that if they don't do it, the past steward used to give them sticks and whips. This case not only highlights the type of work they had to do, but also the type of punishment that threatened them if they did not. In the aforementioned farm of Guayoma, the women were asked if they were forced to work, and they said even more explicitly, I quote, that they are forced to work like slaves in kneading, washing, cooking, making chuas, clay dishes. The crown had ordered that the women and children of Indians from farms who are not in a taxable age should not be forced into any work. However, with the authorization of their parents, they could be compelled to certain occupations. It is possible to verify in Charcas the participation then of children and adolescents in different tasks in the field, in the house of the Lord, or in nearby scenarios to contribute to family subsistence. Unfortunately, historiography has not realized until today the role that women and children has as a hinge between, as a bridge between the Yanaconazgo and other forms of work connected to this system. This labor performance has been read as an annex, eventual, or overlapping in their coercive mechanism despite their illegality, and the experience of these workers overshadow. Another drawback of the approach to the complexity of the Yanaconazgo is to reduce the analysis to the ethnic labor link with the colonized indigenous population. The historical exercise loses a lot when it looks for people to fit into the compartments, estamentos, in which a certain order wanted to put the population, believing that in this way their existence will make certain sense with the context studied. On the one hand, not all the llana initially distributed by the governor Pedro de la Gasca to the conquerors in La Plata and who established their residence in the city were registered in the Toledo census, as I said. Several were left out because their lords had passed away. On the other hand, many indigenous who did not descend from families in bondage, who did not belong to communities or reduction created by Toledo, voluntarily put themselves into temporary service of Spaniards as Yanaconas through a written agreement. This led to the fact that the term Yanacona was frequently used by the farmers to refer all of their indigenous servants, even if they were not really affiliated to Yanaconazgo. The context of labor need, both employers and workers, and of relatively little institutional interference made the agreement feasible, and in this broadening of meaning of the term also. Among indigenous who swelled the Yanacona labor, there were several captives from the Cordillera Chirihuana in the southeast border of Charcas. They were taken captives to all the colonial period to the cities to work in domestic service and in farms under the justification of evangelization and civilization. And when I think about 1608, I remember a document. The court of Charcas specifies, I quote, "They are treated like other Yanaconas," talking about Chirihuanos. Although they were recognized free, they were traded and experienced conditions of unfree submission very similar to those of legal slavery. In 1581, it was arranged that after a census, all the Indians who had been in a farm for more than 10 years, including the Chirihuanos, were held by Yanaconas. Sometimes the labor situation they lived could only be called slavery without ambiguity in the lexicon. Thus, in 1585, 8 indigenous, 5 men and 3 women kidnapped by Capitan Juan Valero, Chirihuanos, were sold as piezas of Chiriguano Indians to Antonio Pantoja de Chávez, according to whom they were perpetual slaves and Yanaconas. Also hard to find, there is information also about this phenomenon in the notarial acts of La Plata, such as the personal service agreement between Alonso Rodriguez, a tejero, and his namesake Alonso, who is listed as Chiriguano Yanacona, like the same category, and who agreed to work for him for 2 years. The service had to be, anyway, voluntary, but it was not always the case. Often the newly arrived captives were directly distributed, as I saw in documentation, among the neighbors. For example, on September 27, 1571, 2 Chaney Indians that Pedro Zárate had led captive to La Plata were handed over as Yanaconas. And I saw also Yamparas and people from other origins taken as Yanaconas. What is important to acknowledge is that the work demands have led to politically shifting categories of identification. The Chiriguanos considered initially irredentos, savage, among other adjectives, who became after pacified infidels, gentiles, pacificados in captivity, became assimilated to Yanaconas without any further objection to the lexical contradiction. The passage from one category to another was not necessarily linear, nor did all the Chiriguanos suffer that fate, but it allows to glimpse the intrinsic complexity of Yanaconazgo in settings such as the jurisdiction of La Plata. It is also an evidence that, at least for Charcas, the Yanaconazgo did not specifically touch only the indigenous population, but also the Afro-descendant, African and Afro-descendant. Lolita Gutierrez finds blacks and free mulattoes registered as Yanaconas in Misque at the end of the 17th century. Many of them were women and children of different ages. The phenomenon extends through the entire colonial period. A complaint from 1774 in La Plata refers to a Zambita Yanacona, fled with two mulattoes, also Yanaconas, from the hacienda of Nicolás Telles. And we can find so many cases like this. Without a doubt, there are many others made invisible by traditional historiography. The transition from legal slavery to freedom was not a straightforward or linear process for African and Afro-descendant workers, as we know. In order to better insert themselves in the labor market, many freedmen entered temporarily or indefinitely into unfree labor relations, sometimes registered as Yanaconas. They worked in the farms of the district of La Plata together with Chiriguanos and indigenous from other origins under the same complex fiscal category. These workers do not seem to have cared too much about their ethnic claim of an origin, as others did, because they sometimes knew very, very little given their captivity, as about the possibility, and that was most important, of better introducing themselves in the labor market, in the labor scene. Unfortunately, their experience have been overshadowed in part also because studies on slavery have rarely analyzed the passage of this legal condition to different forms of free and unfree working situations in which freed population was involved, libertas, libertos. Several historians have noticed the plasticity of some categories and colonial social and labor identifications. That's not something new. However, in the case of Yanaconazgo, they have not focused long enough, I think, in the uses that people made of them when possible, both to be within or outside of their range and according to the particular objectives they were pursuing. To analyze this aspect, I think it's really fundamental because, as stated, there was no single situation of Yanaconazgo, and not all the workers experienced the relationship with the system in the same way. The coercive mechanism of the institution have been very violent and oppressive, specifically in the farms of the district of La Plata and maybe elsewhere, This did not necessarily move to violent resistance against the system, but it also did not mean passive tolerance of the abuse. A variety of mechanisms were put in place by the workers to try to improve their living conditions. These efforts carried out with the impulse of the possibilities that the day-to-day offered them, molded labor relations and sometimes moved alternative senses of the institution itself. On the one hand, there is the undeniable mobility of Yanaconas workers in Charcas. Given the frequent news of abuse and seeking a more voluntary form of employment relationship, the King Philip III ordered that the Yanacona could leave the chacra, the farm, when and how they wanted. Viceroy Luis de Velasco wrote to this king, pointing out the impossibility of making this measure effective in Charcas, given the opposition of the local authorities and the pressure of the interest of the farmers. Years before, Toledo, in his ordinances, had forbidden them to be absent for more than 4 years of the farms where they worked, pointing out the risk of the loitering was actually an attempt to have more control over the workforce, indeed. However, the Yanaconas moved as much as possible to farms with better production or where they were needed seasonally. their bosses accused them from escaping, a term very common to legal slavery relations, and that did not legally fit into the relation of Yanacona and master. They were free. In reality, many were just leaving to return in a seasonal back and forth process, and they did in the longue durée. On the other hand, it is undeniable that the Yanaconas, when they saw it necessary, and it was possible for them, showed a great ability to defend their violated rights before the courts of justice. Some masters did not hesitate to treat the children of workers who were not legally attached to the system as Yanaconas. This frequently happened with Afro-descendants, as I said, who were threatened either by the ghost of the past of slavery or by that of the Yanaconazgo of their parents. The risk was even higher when it came to orphans with not much memory of their parents' past. According to the Sambo Pedro de la Cruz, the widow Margarita de Oviedo had prevented him from leaving his hacienda, seeking to make him appear like Yanacona. I quote, "I was maliciously registered in the farm, as farmers used to, not being a Yanacona, like I am not, for being free of pardonation." Afro-descendant, he meant. Unlike the slavery that was inherited from the womb of the mother, the Yanaconazgo obeyed a patrilineal logic. However, given the subtle practice difference between slavery and Yanaconazgo in rural servitude in this context, the assimilation of both led to flagrant abuses that would not have been recognized if the workers themselves did not carry out these strategies of legal complaint. Around 1770, Manuel Gaitan and several Indian mestizos and Zambos working on his farm in the Choclosa Valley in Tarija, in Chichas, possibly he wasn't aware that he was not right when he alleged, I quote, "These mestizos or Zambas have invented not to be Yanaconas, claiming to be daughters of Spanish, either mestizo or Zambo, that sometimes court judgments declare them for free, although the mother is included in the census." This is highly revealing. On the one hand, it confirms that women were registered and taken as Yanaconas. Also, this was not legal. On the other hand, that the workers knew better than Gaitan himself that the condition of Yanaconazgo was not inherited from the mother. The audiencia finally stated that, I quote, "The children of Yanaconas, of Indian Yanaconas, who come from legitimate marriage with Spaniards, black, mestizos, and mulattoes, follow the condition of the father and therefore must not be Yanaconas." Well, anyway, they made an exception, a perverse exception with the orphans, but I'm not going to enter on those details right now. It would be a mistake, anyway, to believe that the farms of the district of La Plata belonged only to Spaniards. Privileged indigenous were also owners, and sometimes their Yanaconas inherited them, reproducing the logic of domination and dependency with their workers. On his Probanza de Méritos of 1593, the Yanacona Luis de Aldana reported having lands and cattle in the Poco Poco Valley and in Escana, and Yanaconas of different origins working for him. Aldana is a very particular case. Not only he dressed like a Spaniard, but in addition to the rural Yanaconas that worked for him, he had other Yanaconas in the city who were learning tailoring at his tailor workshop. He also had slaves, African and Afro-descendant slaves, and he traded with them. He managed his initial affiliation, so with the Yanaconazgo, in a very pragmatic way until his economic situation improved, and then this category, this personal affiliation, ended up diluting on his daily life. This complex process of negotiating categories of affiliation can only be perceived studying the semantics of dependency at different levels of administration and in the use people made of them. The colonial Yanaconazgo, so just to end this lecture, is a long-standing labor system with changing and complex dynamics. It should be studied looking at its continuities and transformations in the diachronic of social relations and from the synchronous difference of situations in which the workers were immersed voluntarily or forced. legally free and privileged in the urban space, but enslaved under different mechanisms in the surrounding farms. And I don't know if that one, that's also a dichotomy we have to complexify a little bit more. Any case, that's a paradigmatic case, and we can see the difference between rural and urban. The experience of Yanaconas in the jurisdiction of La Plata constitutes a paradigmatic example of the multiple situations that flowed from the same labor institution. Yanacona is, without a doubt, a category of fiscal affiliation within which, beyond the norm, men, women, and children of different ages and ethnic origin were found directly and indirectly involved. The intention of the local authorities and of the owners of business and farms was clear: to solve mechanisms that would allow them to take advantage of all the useful labor available, not only from the legally enslaved, but from the one whose situation lent itself to multiply possibilities of dependency and whose work was far from always being free and voluntary. Relatively little studied labor system in Charcas, this Yanaconazgo, is a melting pot of highly functional processes of ethnification and re-ethnification at different levels, revealing the complexity of free and free labor relations in the region. Some of its features go beyond the transition to the Bolivian Republic, and its imprint can sometimes be seen in the treatment of domestic and rural workers in my country and in other countries in the present time. With this, I would like to thank you very much, and I put an end here to the lecture. Thank you.